Afternoon, good evening, everyone, to colleagues all across the GEF partnership. I am Rosina Bierbaum, and I chair the Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel, or STAP. And I'm really pleased to open this session on using simple future narratives to improve the robustness of project designs. The GEF Secretariat is co-hosting this webinar, and we're pleased for the very strong interest shown by you, our dedicated colleagues involved in design of projects as well as their implementation. So we hope that this session will address what is really a growing and well-recognized challenge. The conditions under which the GEF projects are designed can't be counted on to be stable or linear in this changing world. We knew, but we know more now, that efforts to improve the environment interact with market dynamics, with demographic change, with technological disruption and geopolitical uncertainty. And that makes planning for a single future scenario increasingly inadequate. Yet often, project designs still implicitly assume a likely scenario, defined by things like climate risk or baseline projections. So STAP's role, as you know, is to help the partnership navigate this kind of complexity with methods that are both scientifically credible, but also practical and usable in real project cycles. So this work on simple narratives emerges directly from that mandate. It's not about predicting the future, nor producing elaborate scenarios that are costly or time-consuming. Rather, it's about systematically, if you will, stress testing the project logic against a small set of plausible futures, and then using those insights to ensure that the theory of change and intended interventions remain effective, remain flexible, and most importantly, durable in the face of uncertainty. So we're rooting this training. I think someone is speaking in the background, if you can mute. Okay. We root this training in 4 core ideas. The first is that projects operate within systems, not in isolation. Environmental outcomes depend not only on biophysical conditions, but also on institutions, incentives, behaviors, and power relations. So simple future narratives help make those interactions clear right at the design phase, rather than discovering them later during implementation, often when options for adjustment are limited. Second, robustness matters. In highly uncertain contexts, the best project is not the one that performs best under one assumed future, but one that performs well across several plausible futures. And this is particularly true for investments in developing countries where we know exposure to external shocks can be sudden and extreme, and adaptive capacity may be constrained. Third is that maladaptation and lock-in are real risks. Well-intentioned projects can inadvertently reinforce vulnerable development pathways if those future conditions shift. So by explicitly asking how an intervention performs, for example, under faster technological change or weaker governance or volatile markets, design teams can identify and avoid strategies that are brittle or irreversible. And finally, learning should be a key design feature, not an afterthought. Simple future narratives encourage the project teams to embed flexibility, monitoring, and adaptive management from the outset, thereby emphasizing learning throughout the project. Today's session draws on several STAP projects. Indeed, Dr. Mark Stafford Smith, in his slides, will flash 17 of those reports across your eyes. STAP's ongoing efforts to translate systems thinking into practical tools that can be applied during project design, but without adding unnecessary burden. So I encourage participants to approach this session not as a new requirement, but as an enabling approach, one that can strengthen project logic, improve resilience to uncertainty, and ultimately increase the probability that GEF investments deliver those so important, lasting global environmental benefits. And with that, I'm very pleased to hand over the mic to the GEF Manager of Programs, Dr. Fred Boltz, to offer thoughts on GEF's operational perspective before we move directly then into the technical session led by my senior advisor, Dr. Mark Stafford Smith. Thank you. Fred, over to you.
Thank you, Rosina. Thanks so much. Good day to all of you, dear colleagues, and thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to join you this morning, this afternoon, and evening, and to extend a warm welcome from icy Washington, D.C. to colleagues from across the GEF partnership. I'd like to particularly thank STAP for its valued support, which helps our GEF partnership strengthen the quality, the relevance, and as Rosina noted, the durability of its investments, even amidst a changing and volatile planet. From the GEF Secretariat's perspective, the motivation for this session is very practical. The GEF supports countries to address the underlying drivers of environmental degradation across multiple focal areas, geographies, and diverse development contexts. And these investments are expected not only to deliver near-term results, but to remain effective over time amidst uncertainty and change. And accordingly, our project design approaches as a GEF partnership, all of us, must account for and adapt to a changing planet and changing civilization, often riddled with surprise and deep uncertainty. As we know, climate change risks are intensifying, but they rarely act alone. Shifts in commodity markets, in policy environments, demographic pressures, conflict dynamics, and technological change can all affect whether a project assumptions hold and interact with each other to make the problem even more complex or wicked, if you like. When these dynamics are not adequately considered, projects may underperform, require costly restructuring, fail to sustain their impact, and be maladaptive. I go here and mute everybody. I think that's everybody. The GEF partnership inherently operates in development contexts and natural environments with high uncertainty. And in such contexts, the question is not whether conditions will change, but whether our projects are designed to cope with that change, to be adaptive to the change that is implicit in the system. The simple future narratives approach that Mark will present today offers a way to address this challenge without overcomplicating the project cycle. It does not require advanced modeling or extensive data. Instead, it provides a structured process for design teams to ask better questions early on. Questions such as, what external drivers could plausibly shape project outcomes? How might different combinations of those drivers interact and affect project performance? How may the impacts of these drivers be considered in deciding on appropriate project interventions? And where is flexibility needed to allow for adaptive management over time? That informs, of course, project design parameters and key indicators to track project progress and to enable effective adaptive management as conditions change. From an operational standpoint, this kind of thinking can strengthen several aspects of GEF programming. It can improve the quality of projects at entry by making assumptions explicit and helping teams design interventions that are realistic across a range of conditions. It supports risk management, not by eliminating risk, but by identifying it, enabling us to understand it better and to design to address it. It can reinforce learning and adaptive management that are central to the GEF's results-based management approach. Projects that are designed with multiple futures in mind are often better positioned to adapt and adjust course. And finally, the approach aligns well with the GEF's commitment to supporting countries in navigating uncertainty and building resilience, rather than locking in pathways that may not hold over time. I encourage you all to consider how the concepts discussed today can be applied in your own work within the GEF partnership. All of us together make this partnership work, and having this knowledge makes us all more capable of designing, managing, and adapting projects to our changing reality. I look forward to the technical session and discussion. Thanks everyone for your active engagement. I wish you good learning, as I will also now enjoy. Back to you, Rosina, and thanks again. Back to you and Mark. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you so much, Fred. This is truly a who's who online here. We have more than 100 people. So we look forward to everyone learning from each other. So let me turn this over to my senior advisor, as I mentioned, Dr. Mark Stafford Smith, who's sitting in Australia in his evening. And he has been doing a lot of our systems work for most of the last 7 years. So while you listen to Mark, please feel free to put comments in the chat. And in the Secretariat in DC, Sunday Leonard and Guadalupe Giron will be tracking your chat, trying to answer questions, and then we'll come back and have a great discussion, and we intend to end within the hour. So Mark, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Fred and Rosina. Hopefully you can both see the presentation there, the first slide, and hear me okay. You must be able to because you're sticking your thumb up, so that's good. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you with us. I'm joining you, as Rosina said, from Australia, actually from the unceded Indigenous land of the Yuin people here in New South Wales, which is quite appropriate, actually, when you're thinking about resilience against change over long periods of time, which is really what we're talking about today. So I'm going to open with a very brief overview of STAP's role in the GEF's partnership, and hence our role in project screening, because that sort of frames partly the topic that we're talking about today, which has been ably introduced by Rosina and Fred. And so let me just get into that, because we want to stay well within time. So I think many of you will know, and I'm not going to dwell on this for very long, but STAP's role in the GEF partnership as the science and technology advisory body is really threefold. It's firstly to provide advisory inputs, strategic advice, think about horizon scanning and bringing the latest research into the GEF partnership, and particularly to the council in its strategic considerations. It is in quality control, so a role in screening projects and helping to ensure that evidence-based principles are used in creating good, well-designed projects. And what we're talking about today is one element of that. And thirdly, it is in a sort of more disparate set of things in programmatic and operational support, which includes things like the training that we're doing today. So together, these three roles aim to help GEF projects be well-designed, but also future-focused and innovative, and positioned to have lasting impact despite the sort of changes that are going on in the world that both Rosina and Fred mentioned. So as Rosina said, we produce quite a large number of reports out of all of this, and I'm not going to go through these in any detail, just to say that they are available at that web address there. The ones on the left here are more about processes in project design, and I'll just say a couple more words about that to frame the topic of today in a moment. The ones on the right are more about a range of technical issues that might be relevant and useful to helping design projects like circular economies or chemicals and waste or natural capital. I'm not going to say any more about all of those. Let me go on to say that this ends up being quite a range of guidance, and it is intended absolutely to be support for you, not trying to make your lives more complicated. And one thing that we did do a few years ago was to try and synthesize those in summary into a set of what we called enabling elements for good project design. And again, I'm not going to go through these in great detail. They're listed in that report, but I do just want to quickly outline what they are, because they show where what we're talking about today fits into the overall project design process. So these are the sort of 8 key elements that we identified there. I mean, I think these are 8 key elements at this particular point in time, and they do evolve over time as to which ones are the ones which are, as to what things rather are the things that are sort of most limiting in project design. But they are very quickly to apply systems thinking, and hence develop that into theory of change, as Rosina mentioned. They are secondly, of course, to engage the right stakeholders and think about that in terms of power dynamics and incentives and so on. They are to pursue integrated outcomes, a really important thing for GEF, and actually I think a real comparative advantage for GEF to be able to seek multiple environmental benefits and synergies across the different areas that the GEF services. They are fourthly there to intentionally foster behavioural change. I think we all know that all sorts of outcomes require behavioural change, and we need to think about that consciously rather than just hoping that it'll happen. They are fifthly, as the Council has been encouraging us to invest purposefully in innovation and take calculated risks that are likely to produce high value in exchange for that. They are to ensure that what may be specific projects or case studies actually fit into some sort of vision as to how they could be scaled to contribute to the transformational change in systems that the GEF aims for. Then seventh, they are to ensure that we do have robustness to future change. And this is really the topic that's at the core of what we're talking about today. I won't say more now, we'll go on to that in just a second. But lastly there, and certainly not least, is to support all of this with learning and to do that with good knowledge management. And so all of these topics we see as being really important. And in fact, if I was to, sorry, my system has just gone off doing something unintended, which I hope you can't see. If I was to summarize very quickly the sort of six aspects which would help get things through STAP easily, because it would make a convincing project rationale and description in our review process, there would be these six, which again I'm not going to spend any great time on, but they basically are about defining the problem and the resulting objectives effectively, and using systems thinking and thinking about integration for that. Planning for the future, which is what we're coming back to today. Empowering the stakeholders, providing a theory of change and justifying how the project components come out of that as a consequence, and including things like behavioural change in that. Thinking about innovation and scaling and transformation, and thinking about the whole issue of knowledge management. So today, though, we're really focusing on this one that's highlighted there now, the being able to show convincingly that you've thought about the future conditions that the project must be prepared for, in the sense, as Rosina and Fred have said, that the reality is these projects have got to live in a changing future, and we've got to make sure that what we do isn't going to be a maladaptive, problematic thing. So that's really where we're headed, thinking about this issue of a reasonably efficient way and an effective way of taking account of future uncertainty and ensuring that our projects are able to deal with all of that. So to turn specifically to that and talk to that now for a few slides, I guess I sort of start off thinking of this bunch of roses. So, this is really how the picture of diverse futures unfolding from a single vase can be. They can be yellow or pink or orange. They can be tall or short. They can be fat or slim. However, the reality is that we tend to, in the past, look at our project design more like this top line. We assume that what's going to unfold is a single one of these rose stems, one linear certain future or reasonably certain future, and we plan for that. And in doing that, we're essentially hiding the uncertainty that is actually there that we need to deal with. The reality is the second part of that diagram, that in fact most of our project design is faced with bunches of roses, multiple possible futures which are driven by uncertainties in the sorts of things that Fred just mentioned: economic development, population growth rates, levels of climate change, perhaps technology, and so on. The question then becomes, how do we deal with this uncertainty in project planning without getting too complicated, as Fred has already asserted we need to do, avoid being complicated, I mean. And one answer definitely is to use this approach of simple future narratives to help open up our thinking to cope with these uncertainties. So the problem we're trying to address here is that if we see the future as a single Rosen plan for that, then the plan that may work in that future may not work in a different one. And in fact, worse than that, it may be very actively maladaptive for people and the natural systems that we're trying to help. A second, slightly more sophisticated aspect of this is that if we just focus on a single driver of future change, like climate, without thinking about how that interacts with others, like economy or population change, then we're really designing with our eyes half closed. Because if you think about it, damages from more climate extremes, for example, can be handled more easily in a healthy economy than in a sick one. So there are interactions amongst these different drivers of the future, and it's much more helpful to try and think about them as a collection. So, I mean, an approach to doing this, which has been around for a long time, really, is to use scenarios, which are basically storylines that explore plausible different future states of the world. And there's quite a large literature on these, and there are actually many different types of scenarios, which we don't need to go into right now. But the STAP primer that I'll mention again at the end has a very brief review of all of this if you're interested in knowing more about that in more detail from the scientific literature. The important idea, though, that we're trying to get to is that we're looking for robust interventions. And what we mean by this is interventions which work reasonably well in any envisaged future, for example, across all the simple future narratives that we might come up with, rather than an intervention which is brilliantly optimized to shine really well in one future, but fail and perhaps fail disastrously in others. So we use the narratives to help us think about a wider set of intervention options than we might otherwise consider. And now I suspect anyway, that many of you, when you hear of scenarios, think of hundreds of alternative climate scenarios that are summarized by the IPCC and wonder how on earth you're going to deal with all of them, let alone deal with them and then add in scenarios that involve economics and population and environmental change and technology and so on as well. I think the important thing in a GEF context is that we don't want this process to be complex, and it has to fit in with the usual project design processes. And that's why we just keep emphasizing that we are talking here of simple future narratives. The truth is that having 10 or 100 scenarios with small differences between them isn't going to make much difference to decision making. So the question is really, what is the right sort of level of detail to be helpful? And I want to tackle that question by showing you an example. And the example here is actually one which is one of several which is provided in more detail in STAP's primer. And it deals with trying to manage overfishing and its implications for the marine environment, as well as for local livelihoods in the Caribbean. It is based loosely on projects that we've seen, but slightly abstracted to make a few points about simple narratives here. Now, there had been an analysis of the system that these fisheries sit in, which had been undertaken as a background for the project, and that had identified that climate change and economic development are key uncertainties to think about into the future, and we'll come back to the process of identifying that. So if you've got those two key drivers, but which contain some uncertainty, there may be more climate change or less climate change, and there may be more or less economic growth and tourism, then we can set up a simple 2x2 matrix, if you like, of alternative futures that explore a little bit how those different combinations of these factors can play out. So here you can see we've got a high and low level of climate change and high and low levels of growth, and high and low levels of growth in the economy are likely to be aligned with similar differences in tourism. So the systems analysis in this more detailed work in the primer says a bit more about how these might affect the region. But the key features that come out of thinking about that, let's take a bit of a look at them in these four different futures that result. So down in the bottom left quadrant here, we've got lower rates of climate change, but we've also got low levels of economic growth. So a not very complicated analysis can start to see that this is likely to lower the demand for fish, perhaps, which might reduce the consequences of overfishing. But it also means slower coastal development and slower climate change. And all of that allows ecosystems a bit more time to recover and might allow more time for government to put planning controls into place, for example. However, the fact that you've got low economic growth also means that there are probably fewer jobs for locals. There might well be increased pressure from subsistence fishing, and there's almost certainly going to be less local capacity and resources for government to do planning. So that sort of thing would affect what sort of project focus you might pursue. But the point is, this isn't the only possible future. If we look now at the top left-hand one there, where there's much faster climate change, but still no economic development or little economic development, we sort of have the worst of all worlds. There's environmental disaster, which is sort of overwhelming the limited government resources, and quite likely a general collapse of both ecosystems and local livelihoods. In these conditions, a project is certainly going to need to think about social capital and a variety of other things that you might think about there. If we look quickly at the other two quadrants, then we start to see some other factors. So if you've got stronger economic growth, but coupled with faster climate change, then at least there's more demand for tourism, and that might open up more livelihood options for locals. But there's also greater development pressures, and even though government revenues are better, these are quite likely to be diverted. Certainly the government attention will be diverted to the sort of disaster events that result from climate extremes. So we have both positives and negatives there. And in this sort of future, there's certainly good to be had from helping sectors coordinate a bit more. And very quickly, if we look at this last quadrant here, which is perhaps the most optimistic quadrant for this particular example, you've got more economic growth and you've got less climate change. So there's there are potentially development pressures from tourism, but at least government might have the resources for better planning and management. There's quite likely to be more livelihoods for locals, which may take them away from heavy subsistence fishing pressures. In this future, again, there's good to be had from coordination across the sectors. Okay, so I mean, there we have sketched out 4 things very quickly and briefly, but which start to give us some insights. How does this affect our planning? Well, the key point is that if you take any one of these scenarios and just design for that, that approach is not likely to work very well in some of the others. And remember, here we are talking about drivers which are essentially outside the control of the project. They're not scenarios that we're trying to achieve as a result of the project. They're things that the project is going to have to live with, whatever. So what we can think about here is that interventions based only on policy are likely to fail in any of the futures where government has limited capacity, and those that are focused perhaps only on alternative livelihoods aren't going to work where there aren't any options for that. It's easy to see that also that faster climate change has big implications for disaster relief spending. So in fact, the interventions are affected by the interactions between these two axes. It's not actually very helpful to plan for climate change risks separately to the risks that might arise from different economic futures. So in fact, in this particular analysis, it was concluded that an intervention really needs to emphasize alliances and social capital building across sectors, as well as the diversification of livelihoods, in order to try and perform reasonably well in all of those futures. In other words, to be robust to these key aspects of future uncertainty and minimize the chances of causing some disastrous maladaptation. And I think importantly, like it's taken me 5 minutes, I suppose, to run through that, but it's not a very complex analysis, and you don't have to have millions of scenarios. Just having 4 different perspectives like this is enough to gain quite a lot of good insights. So you might ask then, well, how do you actually go about that in practice? STAP suggests that there are really just 5 simple steps to doing this analysis, and importantly, at least 2 of them are just part of the normal systems analysis for a project, just tweaked slightly. And in fact, the others can underpin the description of the baseline scenario that projects are required to provide anyway. So let's have a look at these in a little bit of detail. So the first 2 on the left there, these are ones which really are just part of what should be in the normal system description for a project. So first, on the left, you need to be clear about what the issue is that the project's addressing and the scope of the system in which it fits. So in the case of the example we've just seen, it's about achieving sustainable management of the marine ecosystem and its related livelihoods in that anonymous Caribbean country we were just in. What's really important for simple narratives is that we identify the key system drivers. Well, we need to do that for anything, in fact. and ideally we would do that with some stakeholder input. In our case here, that included the state of the economy with its effects on demand for fish and levels of tourism and potential coastal development. And it also included climate change. So the one extra thing that we try to think about in the context of simple narratives here is which of these drivers are ones which are more or less certain. So things like global population change, I mean, that's following a pretty clear trajectory. In fact, so is mean temperature rises under climate change. I mean, they're quite certain where they're going. By contrast, population change locally, where there might be migration or immigration or whatever, or indeed climate change locally, where rainfall or storm surge might be much more localized, those things become much more uncertain. So the broad trends and drivers which are reasonably certain, we just need to account for those in all of these futures. So we're trying to pick out here the important drivers which are also have got uncertainty associated with them, and ideally we do that with some stakeholder input. So that takes us on to these next two steps, which is really developing the simple future narratives. The first part of that, number 3 there, is to use some informed choices about which of these trends are the ones that are going to give us most understanding. In general, most usually, this means trying to find a couple of leading drivers which are not particularly related to each other, so you're getting some different information from each of them, but which potentially carry along some other trends with them. So, for example, in our example just now, tourism pressures and the state of the global economy are probably pretty closely linked, and we can sort of treat them as one broad trend of increasing or not increasing so much. But how those change is reasonably independent of the rates of climate change locally, at least. So that can come out as another axis, as we just showed. So having done that, we can start to define a small set of futures. And best practice suggests something like 4, as we've just seen. But actually, the primer discusses where you can actually take some slightly different approaches if you want to. Now, the next thing, then, the 4th thing, is to actually think about the combination of each combination of these main drivers, and also as well as any trends which are going to occur across all cases. And the goal now is to just write a short description, and I emphasize that word short. It's just got to capture some key outcomes in that future, that particularly where they result from interactions between these different drivers. In the example I just showed you, we use some dot points, but really what we're talking about here is a short narrative paragraph, perhaps 150 words. We're not talking about a paper in Nature or the Booker Prize or anything. And the purpose of these things are to highlight some aspects of the future that are different in these 4 cases, if you use 4, and particularly in relation to the sorts of interventions that you've got in mind and are likely to be proposed. These things don't have to be very comprehensive to be useful. Once people start thinking in this way, they start to bring in other issues that might not be in here. It's really a trigger to think more widely. And by the way, these short narratives can largely replace the usual baseline scenario that's called for in project descriptions. This is really just a more sophisticated way of thinking about baseline scenarios that actually allows for the fact that there isn't really one baseline scenario of what's going to happen. There's actually multiple ones depending on how the future plays out. And it doesn't really take much more effort. Okay, then finally, we need to think about the implications of this. So we've got some futures against which we can assess alternative suggestions for interventions, or help think about how suggested interventions can be tweaked to be made more universal and robust. This is really a very quick addition to choosing the proposed intervention and explaining why it's the best one to be doing. This is about making sure that, amongst other things, it's robust to these alternative futures. Of course, there are some contexts perhaps where it's not robust. It turns out not to be very robust, and then you may need to do a bit more thinking and a bit more iteration in the planning, but it's a lot better to do that now than 3 years into the project. And of course, the thinking that results in choosing the particular intervention should then be reflected in the theory of change for the project as that's developed. So really, I think it's fair to say that the process is quite simple. First time you do it, it requires your mind to sort of get around what to do. but it is pretty simple and it's highly compatible with the normal project development procedures. But I think it does two really important things. First, it actually handles all these uncertainties properly in one place, rather than having perhaps a separate analysis of climate risk in one place and economic risk in another and population risk somewhere else. And importantly, putting them in one place means that you can handle the interactions among these things. So, if you're already doing separate risk assessments for the key drivers of the systems that you're designing projects for, then I think this is a much more concise and rigorous and probably quick way of doing it. And, if you're not doing risk assessments of these key drivers and how they're going to impact the future of the place that you're doing a project in, then, well, quite honestly, you should be. But secondly, the other thing that it does is that it really addresses this issue of robustness head on. And that's important as a duty of care to the people that we're designing projects for. It really reduces the chance that we cause maladaptation in the future. And all of that can be reflected in your theory of change. And in fact, quite often, some of the assumptions in the theory of change will be related to whether the drivers of the simple narratives really do play out within the range of uncertainty that you're expecting. So that's sort of doing part of the work of the theory of change too. Okay, I've taken you very quickly through these ideas, but they are spelt out in a bit more detail with a bit more background in STAP's primer on future narratives, which you can find in that link at the bottom of the screen, but we'll put that up. That's available easily on the STAP website. And within the primer, there's a table in section 2.4, which really summarizes everything I've been talking about in the last few slides in a very concise form, in a way that I hope is useful to you as a practical guide for working through these things. And the primer's also got a set of frequently asked questions, which may be useful too. It also contains 3 examples, which includes the one I've just talked about, which are drawn from real projects but amended a bit to clarify various points that we're trying to make there. So it includes the Caribbean fisheries example, also a forest restoration project in Asia, and a third example more on chemicals and waste in textiles value chains in Africa. And that example actually illustrates a different way of going about assessing robustness, which you might use if you prefer. So, I just want to emphasize again that this process can underpin writing the system description and baseline scenario sections in the project design. You might still draw on a separate climate risk statement that would just give you some bounds on the levels of climate change you're considering, but you don't usually need the full-on detail of everything that's going on in those to be able to give you the pictures of these future conditions. The last thing I just want to spend a moment on pretty much is just when you should use these simple future narratives. So, of course, the main time that these are likely to be used is quite early, and it should be quite early in project design. It needs to be when you and your stakeholders are still in the process of fixing on what the focus of an intervention is going to be. This is where the narratives can really help you expand the range of options being considered and ensure that whatever you do decide to prioritize is going to be robust in the face of, in fact, of the various future changes that are going to happen. And this is true whether or not the current project identification form PIF process is retained in its current form in GEF 9, even if that changes a bit. This is still a really important thing to be doing early in project design. Having said that, narratives can also be a handy point of discussion with wider stakeholders as you continue developing projects. It gets them to think about the different ways their system could evolve and probably gives you more insights as a result of how they react to them. So you might return to them a bit during more detailed project design as an engagement tool. And they can also be helpful to interpret the resilience of emerging results, for example, at a midterm review or even at terminal evaluations. And especially at the midterm review or even earlier, this can really help with adaptive management, and especially if the trends you started off considering have perhaps changed in ways that you hadn't allowed for in the initial definition of the narratives. And just my last point to make is that STAP has started seeing these narratives appear in project proposals over the last year. So thank you to those who have had a go at doing some of this. And I just wanted to, I think it's fair to say that the examples we've seen have generally had a bit of a limited appreciation of this issue of robustness so far, but that's clearly changing, which is great. And hopefully this training can assist with that. I will mention, just as an example of a really good example, a recent GBFF project in Indonesia, which articulated 4 different futures. And they had some really nice, useful short paragraphs. I don't know whether they were 150 words or probably even less, but they really got some key aspects of the futures. And then they discussed how interventions that were focused on various different individual elements like governance or community support would work in some of them, but not in all of them. And from that, they came to a really nice little conclusion, which basically drove the decision on what to actually do, which was, which I'm quoting here, was across all scenarios, successful ecotourism strategies should prioritize inclusive decision-making, robust enforcement, and diversified economic activities to maintain ecosystem health and absorb shocks from global crises. So that was a really nice summary out of the thinking that emerged from doing these four futures that then influenced how the rest of the project was developed. And we truly look forward to seeing more analyses of robustness that look a bit like that. Okay, that's all from me at the moment. We're going to turn over to discussion now. I've lost track of what there might be in the chat, but I'll perhaps ask Rosina or Sunday to update us on that, and I'll stop sharing.
That was wonderful, Marky. We're exactly on time. I think for everyone on the first time we did this, we probably could have gone on 3 times as long. And so I hope that this much shortened form gives everyone a sense of the richness of what you can find in our primer. So I do see there are hands up. Sunday, do you want to, is there anything in chat that we haven't seen before we call on whoever CG is? Camille, I think.
Yeah, so before Camille, there's a question here that should simple narratives be done for enabling activities and capacity building initiative for transparency, that's CBIT. Yeah, I'm tempted to say these are not project designed for GEB, so they might not need future narratives, but maybe Fred and Mark might be able to opine on that.
Why don't, Fred, you should opine formally. I'll just say that I think narratives are, this sort of approach to simple narratives is useful any place where you're trying to think about designing something that you're trying to implement for the future, really. But I mean, the level at which you do it and whether you spend several hours on it or just 20 minutes might depend on what sort of scale and stage of project design you're in. But Fred, you should probably opine more formally from a GEF point of view.
Yes, thank you, Mark. And terrific question. And one might think, because EA and CBIT grants are pretty straightforward, supporting government planning and reporting systems, that narratives might not be terribly important. But thinking about the importance of the EA and CBIT work, they're establishing enabling conditions and the effectively underpinning national climate response strategies and reporting on the progress of those strategies. And from that perspective, projecting potential future scenarios and developing those simple narratives that can anticipate possible risks, that can anticipate potentially catastrophic risks of system change, to inform those underpinning plans is valuable. So it shouldn't take a great deal of complex analysis, but that thought is always helpful. As we indicated at the beginning, and Mark has very, very nicely displayed in his presentation, our world is riddled with change and uncertainty. And so all planning tools need to account for that if they're to be effective. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Mark, did you want to add anything before we turn to Camille?
No, let's go to Camille, yeah.
Okay. Camille, I think you can unmute yourself, or Anne. Yes, excellent.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the presentation. My name is Camille. I work with Basel Consulting, and I have actually two questions. One is more on the theoretical aspect, and one is practical. As for the theoretical one, I wanted to make sure, because I'm currently in the process of designing a GEF project, and we are writing the future narrative section right now. And I just wanted to make sure that it's really the axes of uncertainty that the primer talks about are only things that the project cannot influence, right? They're only external factors. That's the first question. And maybe I can ask a second question.
I can answer that very quickly and just say yes.
Okay. That's what I thought. Thank you. And also the other one, you were mentioning this good practice, the example that you were just mentioning, that was a good example that we should follow. Where, that's very practical, where in the CEO endorsement request did they discuss under which scenario the project was robust? Was that more in the theory of change or in the future narrative section?
Let me be clear that they made the case that the project was robust to all scenarios. That's the whole point. In other words, that it wouldn't fail disastrously in one of those scenarios. But I think Sunday or Guadalupe may be able to answer this. I'm pretty sure that just came at the end of the future narratives section, which was probably in the more introductory part, and the bit that I read out was sort of the conclusion from that set of insights, which then led straight into what the project actually proposed to do as a result of that sort of thing. If that makes sense to you.
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much.
But Guadalupe, yes, thank you. Guadalupe has just confirmed that was true. Rosina, I can see a question from Adrian Barnes also.
Yes, let's take that.
Okay, I mean, Adrian, so you say in the chat, should we assume that narrative description should be as quantitative as possible? And I think you mean because partly solutions may only be robust up to a certain quantitative limit, i.e. the sort of coping range. I mean, this is a matter for judgment a bit. I'm not sure. No, I'm actually sure that going to 5 decimal places does not help, right? We are talking here about broad brush. There's so much uncertainty that having too much or seeking too much precision not particularly helpful. What we're talking about here is painting some different futures which give enough insight that we can think clearly about whether the sort of interventions that are being proposed are going to work in all of them or are going to fall down in some of them. So I mean, I think I know where you're coming from here, which is that if you've got quantitative data to define the narrative, well, then that's useful, because it is true that if you can say specifically, you know, the most economic growth that we might get is this, then that might actually set some limits on what you could plausibly expect a government to be able to do or something like that. So it's worth having that, but I just ask you to beware of spending too much time trying to nail down another decimal point. That's really the thing here. These are descriptive narratives that fit in sensible ways. But I can see you have your hand up, so why don't you come back at me on that?
Yeah, thanks very much, Mark. Yeah, I was also building on that. I was wondering, I mean, you mentioned earlier that a project should be robust to all scenarios, if I understand right, you know, to all narratives. But would I not be right in thinking there may be some extreme scenarios to which we can't be robust? I'm thinking, you know, extreme weather events. I'm thinking, you know, a civil conflict, for example. Yeah, a project can't necessarily withstand anything. I think presumably a certain amount of risk might be acceptable. Would that be right?
Yes, I mean, you have to say that that's true, and I mean that of course should be reflected in the risk table in the proposal where you go out. So I mean, again, we're not trying to be too prescriptively comprehensive here. We're trying to say capture more thinking that enables the thinking about what the intervention is going to do to be based on a wider set of insights than it would otherwise be. In the end, as I say, we're not trying to write for a Nobel Prize or whatever. We're trying to do a practical project proposal. So we're just trying to get more insights in quickly and easily. I think you're very right that there will be some potential levels of change. There are two places where the levels of change that you may attempt to make a project reasonably robust to. There are two ways in which that might reappear later in the proposal. I think one is in the theory of change, where you may identify one of the key assumptions being perhaps that the economic growth in an area will be at least something, or that climate change won't exceed 40 cyclones per year or something like that. And if it does, then that assumptions, then you'll monitor that, and if it starts to happen, then you know that you're going outside the range of things that the project can cope with. And the other place you might pick that up in, as I said, is in the risk table. So link those things together. And yes, your point's taken.
Sunday, do you want, or I guess Mark, actually, do you want to say just a quick word about the risk and innovation before, oh no, this is admitting someone, about the risk table and our wish that projects have more innovation risk?
Well, I can certainly say, and this does interact with us a bit, that the council has expressed this quite clear desire to take on an appetite for greater risk in certain areas. So we don't want greater risk of corruption and various things like that. Of course, that wants to be very low risk, but in the area of innovation, where if we don't take some risks, then we're not doing something new. So we're not likely to achieve something that hasn't been done before. The council has really argued for greater risk taking, but done, of course, in a well-designed way. So you're not just taking risks for the sake of it. So in that regard, again, I think future narratives can help a bit. I don't think that the link there is not 100%, but it does support. It does support you thinking about some options or some approaches that might be part of that innovation to try and be robust in some way. Sorry, that's a bit of a vague answer. Were you hinting at something else, Rosina, there?
No. I mean, clearly they do interact, and I thought that would be useful to bring up. We're encouraging innovation risk, but we want you to recognize risk. Yes. We are coming up on the witching hour at the moment. I don't see a question. Sunday, Guadalupe, correct?
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry, there are a couple more here from
Crawford
go. Francis. All right. I think I'm gonna throw this one to Fred. Fred, this is a question on process. I don't know whether you can see it there. But about developing GBFF projects that included future narrative analyses. I haven't seen these ones, so thank you for doing that. But only got STAP review feedback relatively close to expecting CEO endorsement, which included recommendations for more on the future narratives and the theory of change, and how frustrating that was, because it's hard to address those things at such a late stage. I mean, this is a point which interacts with how the project cycle is to be run, Fred. So, which is why I'm throwing that one to you to comment on if you would like to.
Yeah, I mean, I don't oversee the GBFF, so I can't address that one specifically. For the trust fund, we try to get the reviews in as expediently and efficiently as possible. I can share this message with the GBFF team, but I can't explain it, nor opine on whether they can schedule an earlier review. I mean, generally, project managers of the GEF are available for discussion of your proposals and any, including the simple future narratives. You can also reach out to STAP for advice. It's a resource for the entire GEF partnership. So if you have a particular, question on GBFF or GEF Trust Fund projects, we're available for you. Best thing to do is to reach out to your project manager, agency project manager, and to STAP as helpful.
Yeah, yes, thanks, Fred.
And Guadalupe,
and Crawford,
Yeah, Guadalupe Duran handles the GBFF projects and reviews them for STAP, so she is on this call. Okay, so yes, we have two more questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think I think just to round off on Crawford's point, I mean that does come into if something more like the GBFF process becomes wider use across the GEF. I mean there are these issues around the timing of review and how easily it is to deal with. So that's something just to I mean a useful bit of feedback just to carry forwards. Hasita Bamar, sorry, Rosina, I'll just keep going through these questions quickly. Hasita asks, well, just asked me to emphasize that that we're not trying to use future narratives as an expanded risk list. This is about, I mean, some of the things that are highlighted in future narratives may well be things that ought to appear in the risk list as well, per Adrian's comments a few moments ago. But this is really about the early stage decision of what you're going to focus on, rather than a later stage assessment of whether, having decided that that's a good project to focus on, there are still some risks to it being achieved. Okay, so that's a good point. Thanks, Hasita. Jana Kopernik asks, I've probably just mangled your name. Sorry, Jana. Would you have any recent samples, for example, GEF 8, on energy transport and industry project narratives that we consider strong? I'll ask Sunday and Guadalupe to have a think about that. We do find we do try to identify strong ones in each set of projects that come through. So if there aren't at the moment, we'll keep an eye out for those. Then Justin Goodwin has one here on. I'm just trying to absorb this one on transparency. I think maybe, Justin, that's one we might try and answer offline. It's not quite so related to the simple future narratives in particular. I see, I'm sorry, I see, Jana, that Sunday had already answered that. And a nice comment from Stephen Muse at the end there. Back to you, Rosina.
Thanks. Sunday, did you want to make a quick comment on energy projects or not? Or do you want to say that you'll respond to that later?
Yeah, I already responded. We do have a sample PIF that we developed some time ago, although not on energy, right, but on chemicals and waste, but it has simple future narratives in it. But we'll also look out to see if we find any specific energy or transport projects with future narratives.
Okay, thank you. Well, we are indeed at the top of the hour. Thank you, everyone. I want to say we are very pleased to answer questions, and you can send them to Jeff Sek or to anyone that you have connections with on the STAP, because we want to help make this as easy for you as possible. And, you know, I do want to say that the revised PIF, as it is currently, you know, has asked for storylines. And I think this is simply an amplification of you giving us a narrative, not a checkbox. Yep, we thought about this. Yep, we thought about this. And I think what we've been talking about today is very much in agreement with where Jeff has been wanting to move, to think more about policy coherence, thinking about co-benefits or disbenefits that could emanate. And I couldn't help but think, as Mark was doing his wonderful explanation, that these are the kind of things all of us do every single day. Mark, you talked about colors of the flowers. Well, you know, those who are parents or grandparents, as Mark is, you know, we just kind of think about what's our best way to plan for an uncertain future for our child or grandchild. They might want to be an engineer or a musician or a doctor or a chef. We want his granddaughter to succeed. And we have to think about what resources might be needed across finance, across education, across insurance, and across physical fitness. So that's what we're asking for. Fred, would you like to close out the session?
Very kind of you. Thank you, Rosina. Thank you, Mark, for an excellent, very clear presentation. Thanks, everybody online, for your engagement and excellent questions. Keeping us on our game as well. As I said at the beginning, we're deeply grateful to the Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel team for their contribution to the GEF partnership. This makes us current on science and nimble in designing projects that are suited to our uncertain and changing futures. Thanks all of you for thinking about how this applies to your work and thereby developing stronger GEF projects for lasting global environmental benefits. We're all in this together. We greatly appreciate contributions from everyone. And thanks again, Rosina and your team, for your great leadership. All the best.
Thanks. Everyone, have a good morning, afternoon, or evening, and you know how to find us. Let us know if we can help. Thanks, everyone.